Just a couple more minutes and we'll get started. All right, so we'll get started in just a second. Just a couple housekeeping items. If you have questions at any point during the presentation, if you have connected to a microphone or if you're on a phone line, feel free to ask them. If it's something I'm going to if you can, let me know. You can also try the, at some point, some people sometimes have trouble with computer audio, it cuts out. You can also use the phone number listed on the original meeting invite there. So, all right. So I think we'll go ahead and get started here. We're at 3 after records management for modern communications. So this is one of our programs here from the Oregon State Archives that we have been expanding our educational base. So I think many of you probably will have attended one of our Records Management 101 sessions, which covers sort of the basics of public records law, as well as, it's kind of a soup to nuts thing. So it covers that, it covers file systems, it covers electronic records a little bit, it covers some of the stuff that we'll be talking about today. So this session, this modern communications session, the goal here is to spend a little more time focusing just on things like email, like text messaging, like social media, and other types of mechanisms that we use for communication, as these are sort of areas of great concern these days with government. Most of us are using at least, well, we're all using at least one of these technologies, and several others often as well. So it's important to think about them from a records management context in terms of what your liabilities may be, what your responsibilities may be. So that's where this came out of. And I would also note that we here at the Archives are always trying to come up with new curricula, there we go. So actually, and coming up the month of October is American Archives Month, and in conjunction with that, we will be putting out a number of sessions. Some will be the same ones, some will be some new sessions, and actually I will also be doing a session, interstate session with a partner from the state of Maryland Archives for Electronic Records Day, which is October 10th. So those of you who, you would have all gotten a notification of this training event. If you're on the list, and you'd be on the list after this anyways, look out for that. Probably later this week you'll get an announcement about further webinars, and we'll be talking about, in that one, I and my my colleague will be discussing how to deal with electronic records that live in other environments, so that live in dedicated systems like financial systems or personnel systems, those sort of things, how to make smart decisions about how to manage them, and that sort of thing. So kind of an interesting area for that as well. So stay tuned. So let's on with today's session. So obviously modern communications is something that is a constantly evolving term. The term modern itself, just sort of means contemporaneous, and it will shift constantly. So at many different points in time, lots of different things were considered modern communications. So this is a little tongue-in-cheek here, but the funny thing is that antiquated fax machine there, while we aren't usually using those, we are still using fax machines more than I would think. It's the technology that refuses to die, apparently, but we won't be talking about those today. What we will be talking about are a variety of different communication mechanisms that we use today to communicate in the office and often in our personal lives, and sometimes intermingle them. So things like email, of course, instant messaging. So this is something that's sort of, instant messaging is funny. When I was in college a decade and a half ago, instant messaging was the hot thing, and so we'd use things like AOL Instant Messenger and things like that to communicate with other students. And it kind of died out after the advent of smartphones. And then, lo and behold, it's made a comeback with the office environment. So now you have services such as Slack, Spark, and there's Skype for Business, and there's a bajillion other ones that folks in government agencies and private entities alike are using to communicate sort of in lieu of or in conjunction with emails inside an agency. Of course, text messaging, like we think of it, the traditional messaging from our phones, but also then a variety of different mobile messaging applications. So things like Snapchat and WhatsApp Messenger and Facebook Messenger and a bunch of different types that people have. iMessage, if you have an iOS device. So lots of different mechanisms, most of them not controlled, so there's some challenges involved with that. So that's something we have to think about. And then social media, which at its core is not primarily a communication mechanism the way we think of the others. It's more one-directional. However, it nonetheless facilitates a lot of communication. People post, people comment, people have private messages going back and forth. So it's definitely an area we need to think about quite a bit these days. This is a truncated slide that we borrow from our other presentation because it's important to at least give a context for what we're talking about here. So what do we consider a public record? And that would be in any format, so whether it is in a digital format or a paper format of any type. So first of all, we're looking for this three-part test. Is it prepared, owned, used, or retained, and relates to an activity, transaction, or function of an entity, government entity, and is necessary to satisfy the fiscal, legal, administrative, or historical, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, you have it. It relates to something you do, and you have a need to keep it for some reason. This is often sussed out in the schedules, which we will not be discussing today. So if you have not had the Records Management 101 session and you'd like more information about schedules and this sort of stuff, I encourage you to sign up for one of those sessions to sort of fill in the gaps. But I'm assuming a basic level of knowledge of that at this juncture. So the goal here is we're going to be talking about content that we figure are records. And not all of it is, but we're gonna assume it meets this definition. And another big part of this in the Oregon Public Records Law is that explicitly states it's without regard to technology or medium. So that means it does not matter what technology you are using to communicate, what format the communication files reside in. It is still can be a public record if it meets this definition. So we'll start today with email, which is really not that new. So email has existed since actually the first emails were generated in the 1960s. Widely used within certain communities in the 80s more rapidly, and then really as of the 90s became the dominant mechanism for communication in almost any type of organization. It's got a long history to it, and one would think that would mean we'd have it all hammered out, but the reality is that for a very long time, people sort of pretended that email was not a real record the way they thought of paper letters, for example. And so this, for a long time, led to us doing very little about it. It just kind of was there, and people tried to treat it like it was ephemeral or make big rules that didn't really apply. So we've come beyond that thought at this point. It's been identified across the board as very definitely a record that we need to think about, or containing records that we need to think about. But we now have to come up with techniques to manage it. So what are some of the problems we face with email? Well, we have a lot of it, and we create more and more of it all the time. So we generate massive amounts of email, and it's growing exponentially, quite literally. Traditionally, IT policies have often been in charge. IT has set policies to manage the infrastructure, which often relates to how much can we store before we're out of space or don't have the money to store more. So that's in the past has often been how retentions were set on emails, which is, well, we run out at 6 years, so everybody's got a 5-year limit or something like that. So I've seen far more draconian ones. I've been in organizations where they say, oh yeah, everything's got a 90-day policy. I fortunately don't see that much anymore. I think people are more aware. But this is often where it was left with because it was not seen as a records issue at the time. There are a lot of potential public records in emails. I hope this is obvious to people. We spend most of our communications these days take place via email in terms of business conversations. So if we didn't capture any email, we would have a massive hole in our documentary record, really. Attachments can also be records, of course. Sometimes email is just used like an envelope, essentially. You're sending something to someone, so the document attached to it may be far more important than the email itself. But it can be very challenging to classify the content in an email because as conversations go, you change topics, you move from something to another, you fork off into 2 different conversations. Sometimes you mix personal and work in the same email. So it can be very challenging to classify the content and therefore identify how long you have to keep this stuff. So we tend to find, when I go into an agency and talk to people, you find sort of 2 kinds of email users traditionally, and this is a bit of an exaggeration. Certainly, I think a lot of people fall in the middle, but these are the extremes. We find the hoarder. So the idea of this is the person that feels very strongly that all of their stuff should be kept just in case, or somebody might need that thing. I've heard this argument a lot. They have trouble honestly staying on top of anything because they can't find what they need. If they're keeping everything, it's very hard to find the stuff that actually has value, which leads to costs associated with retrieval and the hours spent looking for stuff and all that sort of thing. And this is turns into a constant battle with storage capacity and the ability to actually retrieve information. The opposite end of this, which I see less of these days, but I used to see a lot more, is the idea that this person says, well, if I don't have it, I don't have to retrieve it, I don't have to turn it over, it's gone, I never had it, etc. So the idea is if they can get rid of everything, they feel that they're somehow indemnified from never needing to worry about it. Of course, this is a major violation of public records law. Things have retentions on them. You can't just decide to get rid of everything and pretend you don't. And okay, the inherent fallacy in this, of course, is that any email you've sent has 2 people involved at least. There's a sender and a recipient. So even if you're purging everything you have, thinking that covers you, somebody else has a copy of this thing, and that is not a situation you want to find yourself in. When you have gotten rid of things you shouldn't have, and somebody else says, "Oh, but I've got them over here," which is going to raise questions about why you don't have them in this context. So something that we try to avoid, and fortunately, I think people are a little better about this than they used to be. I run across way more hoarders than burners in this case. So acknowledging some of the challenges with email. We in the records management community and in the archives community have really begun to sort of change our thinking as to how we should be educating people about email. Used to be, we just sort of say, you got to sort it by content. Of course, what are you talking about? It goes into the record series. We have these things. Sorry, one second. Somebody's having a little trouble with the slide screen. So hang on a second here. If everybody else is also chopped off, I don't want to take the risk of that getting wonky. So hang tight one second. Let me change my sharing settings. Is that better? Hey. All right, cool. Sorry about that. That's I tried to just have it save. I had tried to just have it display my PowerPoint instead of the whole screen, but apparently that doesn't work very well. So, okay. All right. So now that we've got a clean screen in front of you there. So as I was saying, just asking people to sort everything by content, is not particularly compelling or practical. The reality is that nobody has the time to do that or clearly identify all their content. It takes up too much time even if you spend all your time doing it. On the other hand of that, there is no magical technology that does this for us yet. So I think all of us have been waiting for quite a while for automation to make this easier. The good news is that it is a thing that is coming. There is absolutely going to be automatic sorting of email coming to us at some point. The challenge, of course, is that it's going to take time and money. That technology sort of exists in some of the cutting-edge tech companies. But even they will admit that it's far from perfect at this point. These things can learn, you give them a lot of examples and they learn, but they're still, they may only be 60 to 80% accurate, which, for government records is not really sufficient at this point. We don't want to take that chance because 60% is not very good. So correspondence is one of the trickiest things for computers to learn. They can learn if you have standard forms. So if you have a form that is the same every single time, and you've got information elements in the same places, a machine can learn pretty quickly, this is this thing and not that thing, and categorize it. But emails, being as they are communications between squishy humans, we have all sorts of intermixed thoughts, and we don't follow protocols, and we don't always use the same terminology, and we misspell things, which can make it very difficult for a computer algorithm to interpret that. So what that means is that we can't really just sit and wait on this technology. It'll get to us eventually, but it's not here yet. It's not going to be here for probably at least, I'm guessing, a decade. It could be less, honestly, but I'm always trying to be conservative on this. So with that, we do have to make a decision on how we're going to handle email. So a couple lessons we've learned. The less sorting we ask people to do, the greater they are to comply with that. So if you hand somebody a pile of papers or a pile of emails, so to speak, and you ask them to sort them into 15 or 20 categories, how well do you think that's going to go? They may do it the first time, and then over time they're going to rapidly decide they've got 3 categories they really like, and they're going to file them into those, and they're going to make them fit because it's just too much brain power and too much interpretation trying to figure out which of those 20 categories it's got to go into. However, if we give somebody 5 categories, that's a reasonable ask. I can manage that. I can sort things into 5 categories, and then, the exact number, this is just an example, but the idea is that the less sorting we ask people to do, the more likely they are to actually do it, and the happier they'll be in general. So going along with this, we've also learned that email content can be predicted when we are talking about our work lives. So while we are all special butterflies, unique in every characteristic in our personal lives, we are not in our work context. We serve a function. And yes, our own personalities and style shine into that a little bit, but the reality is the topics we cover, the sort of materials we just communicate about will be very much the same as the previous person that held our position and that of the next person that is going to hold our position, or other people we work with. Our job duties define what our communication content probably is going to be about. So knowing that we can somewhat predict what people do based upon their duties, what can we use to make it easier to manage our emails? So there is what we call a practical approach in this case. So this is something the federal government actually has been spearheading. As of 2013, they issued a government memoranda, basically talking about what they were doing for federal government. The idea is that they're calling it Capstone. The idea is that they are going to define retention based upon the role people play in an organization. For them, they basically say they're top tier personnel from any given agency, so whether it's the FBI or the EPA or you name it. The top level personnel are permanent because they're the big decision makers and people want to make sure that content is kept. And everything else in an agency, every other person in an agency is something shorter. Now the specific length of time they're keeping that is depending, it's up to the discretion of the agencies. This technique, while not necessarily, it does not, of course, apply to non-federal entities, as a technique has gained a lot of traction because those of us at the state level and folks in local governments have long been looking for a solution that might work. So this has started to see traction. I personally work with folks from a lot of different states, and I'd say the general consensus right now is this is the only way to go at the moment. Not everybody loves it, of course not, but it's generally seen as the best option we have. It does seem a little bit too much all or nothing for our purposes here. So the idea is if everything is either permanent or some shorter blanket retention, so say everything is permanent or 7 years, there's not a lot of nuance in that. And there's a lot of things that should fall in the middle that probably are getting missed in that is our feeling here. So what we at the Oregon State Archives are promoting are what we're calling a modified capstone approach. And in this context, we are still saying we can basically assign retentions based upon people's duties, but it's not going to be one across a whole organization. So if you have 100 employees, you're not going to have 15 of them permanent and everybody else 5 years. There's going to be different flavors and shades of it throughout the organization depending on people's roles, and I'll elaborate on that in a second. There will also be some sorting duties still required in some cases. Things like project files and case files and contracts. If you work with facilities, so the retention is based on the life of that facility. If you work with employee files, that's pegged to how long they're working there. Or if you work with students or prisoners or anything that involves humans, the retentions are associated with that individual person. And it's very difficult for you to apply a retention to that person's account, the person that manages all these people, because essentially it's a constant revolving base. You'd never be able to purge anything as a base rule for these things because you're constantly getting new employees that bump that timer out. So in that case, we are saying for those sort of files, you do still want to pull those out and file them appropriately. So if you have employee files, correspondence relating to that person should go into that file. Similar with the facilities files or any of these sort of things. The good news is, of course, you're already used to filing paperwork or paperwork or digital paperwork, so to speak, for those type of files. This is not a new thing, and they're pretty easy to identify. Am I talking about this subject or this contract? Yes, great, it goes into that file. So for people that deal with those sort of things, there's still a little bit of a sorting burden, but it's a pretty easy one. There's not a lot of gray area. It's very easy to identify the content comparatively. So how does this actually get applied? So let's talk about that a little bit. Basically, there are two ingredients in how we would come up with a capstone retention in this case. So we use the job description and the records retention schedule. So the job description, as we know, may or may not be updated. So this updated regularly or may be a little inaccurate based upon reorganizations or things like that. So you do have to pay attention to what the person actually does. So if your job description was written 15 years ago and you've since taken on 5 other duties, you need to account for that, and that becomes part of that tool you're using essentially. What you do though is you're going to compare the job duties this person does with the schedule items that are produced by those job duties. So I do certain types of functions, I create these sort of records. What's the retention associated with those? You're going to look at that, and you're going to find the longest likely retention from all the different things I touch. So I might touch records that are 3 years, I might touch records that are 5 years, and I have some that are 10. So if we look at all my duties, the longest retention I have are things that are 10-year retention, we're going to say my email account is a 10-year retention. So my emails will be kept by default for 10 years before they are purged. So again, it's the longest likely retention. We do not spend a lot of time panicking about weird special cases because you can always come up with a for instance when you have something that was grossly longer. People need to be smart about those sort of things and say, well, they do happen occasionally, but in those scenarios, you need to be savvy enough to understand, well, that's clearly beyond my normal retention. And we also know this is not perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than what we've been doing, which is a mishmash of nothing and or trying to do it all. So it's not perfect. It's the best effort we have right now, and it's still a lot better than what's been going on. So this is not a special retention. So I would note this is not like you are looking at a bunch of different people's files and saying, we're going to make you 15 years. Well, you need to be able to point to a specific retention that says 15 years. So if you're going through somebody's duties and you see a range of retentions up to, say, 10 years, and then you decide, I want to keep this person's account for 12 years, we're going to ask the question, where'd that 12 come from? This is not an opportunity to just make up new retentions. The point is that you are using the existing schedule to justify your retention of records. So essentially, yes, you are over-retaining some things. And for those of you here, I'm not sure, looking at the roster right now, we probably have a few people from state agencies. So for state agencies, the schedules are written in such a way as they are supposed to be a minimum and a maximum. So you'd say, wait, this puts me out of compliance. I am over-retaining some records. And we acknowledge that. The intent of that rule, the maximum, is it is a practical rule to make sure people don't just hoard things forever, and this is a miscellaneous forever pile. So we always routinely over-retain some things, but it's for a fixed, understood period of time, and it's justified. So in this case, this is clearly justified because it's a practical matter. We have to deal with it this way. Otherwise, we just paralyze ourselves. For those of you at local entities or county entities, you do not have that maximum as a hard requirement, so it's kind of a moot point. We always encourage folks to follow the schedule as closely as possible, but always, again, in practical situations like this, over-retention can definitely be justified so long as it is set on a real thing and not just a, but I think I might want this thing. That's what we're trying to get away from. This also does not need special permission from the state archivist. So there's no paperwork burden with this. If you decide you wanted to implement this, we are happy to advise you, to give you, to sort of give you some advice. If you say, hey, this is what we looked at, what do you think? We're happy to do that. Folks in our records management section are pleased to look at that for you. But again, you don't need our sign off so long as you're following the guidelines here, so long as you're making sure it's based on actual schedule items and you document your process so you can justify it in the future, because you may have to shift this in the future, or somebody coming in later might go, wait, why is this set? You want to make sure you document that. So I'm going to show a couple examples here. First one, this is a pretty easy one. So this is a hypothetical agency director, and I just kind of pulled some examples from a general schedule here. So you could say their duties involve directing policy and setting strategy, setting priorities and institutional focus, approving the budget, communicating with the public and other entities, and approving annual reports. And again, I always forget to remove that extra comma there. So, but this could go on. These are a smattering of things. This person's duty could cover a whole lot of different items in the schedule, with retention all over the board. So really, in this case, from anywhere from nothing to essentially permanent. And with that in mind, we're going to mark this as a permanent account. And generally speaking, your city managers, your senior directors, people that really direct an agency or a large portion of it, often justify a permanent retention. You might find, and where that sits, is going to vary organization to organization. So the exact place that is, there's some nuance to that. Example number 2. Let's look at an office receptionist. So this person's job is to involves overseeing sign-in of guests, managing executive schedules, maybe answering phones and opening incoming mail, booking facilities for meetings and coordinating those meetings, as well as a variety of other support functions. Maybe they order supplies, maybe they, these sort of things to make the office run. These folks don't generate a lot of unique record content. A lot of what they're creating is they're brokers, they're handing things off and sending things through. So as such, they are often not the primary record keeper for a lot of things anyways. There are some schedule items that would apply listed there, with retentions in my example here of anywhere from 1 to 4 years, so relatively short. And in this case, we're going to say, okay, that receptionist has an email retention policy of 4 years, because that's going to cover basically everything they touch regularly. So that's a pretty straightforward one. You will find some in the middle, however, they're a little more challenging. So as I mentioned before, the blanket retentions don't work for every kind of record, so it really doesn't work for employee records, contracts, building records, or other highly variable record series. And these are typically ones that are not an orderly accumulation every year, like fiscal records. It's, what is it, 6 years, I believe. Basically, it's pegged to like the audit cycle. So you go, you've got your records, and every time you just drop off the last year, they're orderly, they're predictable. However, if you're working with contracts, you could have contracts for 1 year, you could have contracts for a decade, and they could be renewed, and there's a lot of variance in that. I mentioned already the employee example. These are pretty much impossible to proactively predict and then treat everything as the same. So with that in mind, we want to separate out. So the general correspondence for that person would still have the base retention. So you would still look at this person's position and decide what their base retention was going to be. But then they would also have certain types of these, what I call case file documents, there where they would need to file them into their own folders, into separate folders for retention associated with those specific records. And whether that's a place outside of the system, it's in your email, it's parallel, or whatever else, doesn't really matter from this context, but they would need to be identified and pulled out so they don't get purged automatically with the rest of the emails on that. So that's sort of the programmatic level, what we're trying to teach agencies to look at. There's also other things that we'd like to sort of encourage folks to learn more just on the user level, tips to do a better job of email management. So first of all, it's important to know what you do not need to keep, and this is for any employee. You do not need to keep these things. FYIs, CCs, and informational notices, anything in which you are not the primary recipient and you're not being asked to do something, you're being brought into the loop, but it's clearly other people are the primary correspondents. You are not required to keep these. You are not the record keeper. Ads, listserv messages, and event announcements, as well as spam. Of course, all of this sort of stuff that is not directly related to your duties, all of this is not your content. It does not meet the standards to be considered a public record for Oregon. Personal correspondence, of course, whatever you have in there, best to get rid of it as soon as you can, just to keep things neat and tidy. Also, articles and reference materials, and sometimes people might say, well, I was tasked by my boss to go ahead and do some research on this to make a decision. But those materials you're gathering are for immediate use. They're not generated by your agency, and they're not considered an agency record. So you might use them for a short period of time and then purge them as soon as you're done with them. Another thing to keep in mind is who's responsible for managing an email. You got 2 people involved at least in every email that's sent or received, so who's supposed to keep it? For internal email, we are looking at the sender. The sender is typically the person who would be most responsible for keeping internal emails, because they're the ones taking an active role in this. They're the ones that are generating the content. From an outside source, however, email coming in from outside of your entity, the recipient, whoever is the person it resides with in the end, they're the ones responsible for it. And so you could have some situations where an email comes in and is routed. Maybe it goes into somebody's assistant, and that assistant forwards it on to them. You decide ahead of time who's going to be the one managing that, but ultimately 1 copy is all that's necessary to keep in that case. Other things that generally are good practice for this. So it's generally wise to make sure that you are purging your deleted items folder in your email account regularly. So whether you're using a Outlook-based environment or a Gmail, you don't want things just sitting around in your deleted folder forever, because those things are still discoverable potentially if you get a public records request or any discovery request. They take up space they don't need to. So the idea is that you shouldn't keep them in there any longer than you need to realize you accidentally deleted something and move it back, put it into another folder again. Usually I see purge cycles anywhere from 30 to 90 days. Those are reasonable. There's really no reason to be keeping it longer than that. So it's worth checking to see if your organization either has if your IT does an automatic purge on deleted items folder, or if it's left entirely to employees. If it is left to employees, it's good to educate folks about cleaning those out, because it does start to take up some space, and again, it opens you up to potentially having to retrieve those things later. Just from a usability standpoint, I really encourage folks to utilize useful and specific subject lines. So I get a lot of emails that simply say meeting invite in the title, or they just say ORMS as per my job, which I now realize I didn't actually introduce myself. I'm Chris, by the way. Hi. The things you do when you start going on autopilot. So I get a lot of those that don't really help, because then when I have to go searching for something later and I do a search, I'm getting tons of hits, tons of hits that aren't necessarily what I'm looking for, and I have to look at every single email. So as much as possible, make reference to specific dates, names, topics in your subject line, so people can very rapidly retrieve them later. It's a lot more helpful. Also, note that you only have to keep the last message in a string. You are not required to keep every copy, because you go back and forth, back and forth. You could have 20 different versions of an email essentially sitting in your Outlook account. I know that if you're using a Gmail system, they condense these things automatically, but Outlook doesn't by default. So basically what happens is you have all this detritus sitting below it. And so for that, I really encourage the use of the Outlook cleanup tool. So anything from Outlook 2010 forward has this nifty little button, which I've highlighted there in your menus. If you click that, it will purge everything that is truly duplicate content up to the last copy. It is very safe. It's, in fact, very conservative in a way that if there's any change at all, somebody deleted a period or a signature file, or there's an attachment, or any possible change, and it will keep it as a unique object. So it'll only keep the last version of every type of that email string. So if you split at some point, had a conversation over here, it'll keep both of those plus the last, plus an example of the last complete one. So there's a lot of things that will be protected that way, but it's a lot easier than doing it manually, which I used to do. So definitely, and you'd be surprised how much bulk you could eliminate. I've seen people just cut their email accounts almost in half just by using that cleanup tool. So you want to do it on your inbox, and you want to do it on your sent file to go ahead and purge all that stuff. All right. Any questions about email before we move on? Okay. Again, if you have questions at the end, or if you want to talk to me after the fact via email or on the phone, I'm happy to help you with that. So let's talk about social media a little bit here. So first question, is social media a public record? Well, yes and no, maybe. Does the content meet the public records definition? Like, that's always our first question. Just because something, a format doesn't dictate that something is or is not a record. So does the content meet our public records definition? You're creating it, it documents something you do, it's necessary for some reason. Is that content unique is the other question we ask. So a lot of agencies, when they dip their toe into social media, is they create a Facebook account and they just start posting things there that they're also posting on their website, or they're also putting out via press release or whatever. In that case, the thing you're posting there is not unique content. It's a duplicate record, and therefore it's not necessary to be kept. Retention is going to be based on the content and the function of the record, of course, like usual. So with that in mind, how are we supposed to address it? Well, first of all, everybody should have written policies and procedures addressing how your social media is going to be used. So your use, access, retention, and ownership of your social media presence on however many platforms you're using. For state agencies, this is part of a required records management policy that everybody's supposed to have on file. For local and county and other types of agencies, it's not a hard requirement, but it is heavily recommended that you have some sort of coherent policy statement, not only on records management in general, but also specifically on social media. So it's clear about who has responsibility for doing what your policies are regarding it all, about the sort of content you allow, about moderation policies, about how you're going to keep or capture your content, etc. You also do need to have a plan in place for capturing content that you might need. So using my press release example, press releases have only a 1-year retention. They're very short records. And you could say, well, I could just post that on Facebook. It'll still be there in a year, and I've met my requirements. And most of the time, you'd probably be correct. But as I think people are more and more aware of, when you sign on with one of these free services, there is no ownership. We can't control any, once we posted something, we have no direct control over what happens to it. So administrators at Facebook or an algorithm can decide that that is inappropriate, or they just want to clean up space, and they can purge it at any time, and we have no recourse to that. So it's very important that you do not rely on these third-party providers that we're not paying. They're not under contract with us, therefore they don't have to meet our rules. It's very important that you take things in your own hands to make sure content is kept for the appropriate period of time. Some of these things offer built-in mechanisms. Twitter, for example, you can download a log of all of your posts and things. That's great. Facebook has a download option. It is a bit clunky. It disassociates the posts. It does not preserve the look and feel very well. So test with, you want to play around with that if you're going to try to rely on that. It's not perfect. There is also software that can be utilized. So if your agency or entity has a relatively heavy social media presence, you have multiple accounts, maybe you post a lot, you have conversations there, manual management may not be ideal. So in this case, you're probably going to want to look at software that's going to allow you to control it centrally. So I list a few examples of companies that exist. I'm not endorsing any of those particularly. They all have their strengths and weaknesses in terms of what they can do for you, but they are often, there's a cost involved, but often it's justified based upon the potential costs of losing content or facing lawsuits. You can also, if you are not one of these heavy users, if you have only a little bit of a social media presence and you don't use it a lot, composing and controlling locally is a valid strategy. So basically you say, well, we're not going to try to capture, we're just going to create in a Word file locally or something, save that with a notation about when it was posted, and then post the other copy, because now, voila, it's redundant. So there are ways to do that. You can also take simple screenshots. Just take a screenshot of the thing when it's posted, and that would meet the basic letter of the law in that case as well. So some common questions people ask. Can we moderate our page? Yes, of course you can. But it's important, again, that you document your policy and follow it consistently. You do not want to give the impression that you are making decisions capriciously or with malice because you like one person and not another. So it is very important that you have a crafted policy in terms of what you will or will not allow on your page, and post that in your About section on your Facebook profile, for example, or have it as a banner on your other accounts. Make sure it's clear what will be allowed and what will be purged. So will people still complain sometimes? Oh, absolutely. But you will have something to back yourself up. Another question, of course, are comments also records? Yeah, not necessarily, just like a lot of things. But yes, the general rubric here I follow is if an agency responds or takes actions based on a comment, now it's now a record. It's either correspondence or, so somebody posts something reporting suspicion of a crime or a pothole that really needs fixing, or those sort of things, and you then do something from that. Yeah, you're going to capture that as part of the documentary record of that action or the conversation you had. If they're simply saying cool because you posted a picture of of some festival you had or things like that, they're not gonna, that doesn't really matter. So you have to use a little bit of your judgment there. Private messages, similarly, it's correspondence the same way. The problem is, of course, is we're not controlling that mechanism, unlike your work-issued email address. So as much as possible, we encourage you to try to route that conversation to a government-controlled platform as soon as you can. So somebody sends you a private message, ask them to, or respond to them via email, ask them for their email address so you can respond appropriately that way. Try to route it. If you can't, again, try to capture it. If you have to use screenshots or forward it on, whatever you got to do, make sure you're capturing that content so it isn't treated as something else, so people are aware of that. So that's social media. I think this is something that it's getting easier because it's so ubiquitous. A few years ago there weren't even the tools, so that's helpful, but it can be challenging. So let's talk about mobile devices. So I'm going to assume you are all just dying of laughter right now because of my super clever photo here. Mobile devices. So mobile devices, as I think we're aware at this point, are amazing little computers we carry around with us all the time and use for everything but mostly crushing candy. In a work context, they can be tremendously valuable. They're a dynamic platform that goes with us. But they open us up to tremendous liabilities as well. And if your entity has a information security officer and you want to see somebody talk at length about all the problems with phones, you just ask them about information security of personal devices. So traditionally, in the last 15 years, really, in the last 10 years especially, financial decisions by agencies and corporations alike, as well as employee desires, have really driven a bring your own device policy expansion. So the idea is that people don't want to carry two phones around, or I don't want that clunky work BlackBerry. I'm thinking back 10 years ago. I don't want to do that. I've got my phone. I like my phone. I want to use my own. And the folks holding the purse strings looking to go, well, look, we could save $5,000 a year if we aren't doing people's phones for them. Or whatever, and so they said that's great. Unfortunately, this opened up agencies to a lot of other issues, and this is where the aforementioned information security folks stepped in and said, this is an uncontrolled environment. We don't control these devices anymore. We have very little control over government data that may exist on there. It's very difficult to retrieve things in the case of a public records request. We have people intermingling their personal and public work, which becomes ever more difficult to extract after the fact. So what are we going to do about this? And honestly, the same could happen if you had government-issued phones, although you have a little more control of that sometimes. So specifically, let's talk about our messaging. So text messaging and messaging apps, who holds them? Well, it's not us. We're using Verizon or T-Mobile or Sprint or AT&T or whomever. They're the ones who are having these messages routed through their servers, and they, again, don't have to turn over. In fact, they will not. I've almost never seen a situation where they would. How long are they keeping them? Very short periods of time. There was a survey done a few years ago, and they ranged from a couple weeks to 6 months. I'm sure that's well outdated at this point. Who knows? But the long story short is we can't rely on it. We do need a good policy, generally speaking, about what appropriate use of these messaging platforms are. Generally speaking, I recommend having a policy that goes against using these mechanisms for big conversations. What I mean by that, substantive business conversations about policy, about contracts, about personnel, about any of these things that have long retentions and are significant content. You don't want to have to worry about trying to capture that. So I really encourage against it. Mobile messaging can be very handy for logistical things like, where am I going? What's the address? I'm running late. Can you call somebody? I'm not able to get to them. Those sort of things, which are not long-term records, if they're records at all, and have a lot lower risk involved with them. They're logistical planning things. So in that, we have sort of a sample phrase: the substantive business-related discussions are not to take place via mobile messaging. That can be hard to enforce, so it's something to think about, but it's a good start. However, we acknowledge that sometimes that just won't work. I have worked with agencies here in the state that deal with at-risk youths or deal with certain communities of people that you're not going to get them to email. If you're working with a teenager and checking in on them, you're not going to get them to send an email to your work. I mean, you might as well hand them a slate and a chisel and ask them to send that. They're going to look at you like you're a dinosaur. So the thing is there are certain outwardly facing groups that you're going to have to meet the public where they're at, which may in fact be on their mobile devices, most likely. So we acknowledge that, and in that case, a blanket policy saying don't do that just isn't really realistic. So in some cases, we have to do this, or we have conversations that stray. I do sometimes. I try to be very diligent about not doing that whenever I can, but occasionally, yeah, it crops up. So first of all, we have some options. If this is an occasional thing, you can manually forward those messages onto your government email. So any text messaging service, you can simply punch in, if you have a smartphone, you punch in the email address in there and it will shoot it off to your email instead. You can do that as an automatic auto CC on messages as well. This really only works if you're very clearly only using a certain thing for work, because otherwise it's going to be forwarding all your personal stuff there too, and that may not be what you want. I'm just guessing. So be careful about that, but that does work. Again, kind of ad hoc, but it can function. For a more comprehensive approach, really you need something called mobile device management. This is a software segment. That's not a brand, that's a generic term. That's fairly new, only in the last couple of years have you really heard of it much, as people are acknowledging all these problems. What mobile device management can do is allow your agency to exercise centralized control. So your IT department can basically install a piece of software on your phone or on the agency issued phone. This would be built in. Allowing them to manage various devices used for work and control the content. So it can, for example, provide certain messaging apps that you have to use for work, and those would automatically be captured, which is handy. So now you could say, well, I'm using my own phone. I just use the default text messaging application for myself, but we have a special messaging app that I know for work-related texts. I'm going to use that because that's controlled and captured, that sort of thing. You can actually hard lock it that way, so they're only allowed to do that on certain phones. There's a lot of different levels of security here. You can actually sort of create a partition where half your phone is work and half is private. You can do copy home. They can also do a remote wipe on the government data, so your phone goes missing and you've had access to government information. They can basically remotely wipe the content from afar next time somebody turns it on, essentially. You can also sometimes have, I've seen some with basically a virtual second phone number. So you have your phone with your phone number, and then there's basically a virtual phone inside there, so you can make calls and text from that other phone number, which again are now a government issued thing. So that can be a tremendously powerful tool. It could, of course, has costs involved, and so you may not want to do that for your entire entity. For instance, we might just be looking here at the Secretary of State's office. We're looking at senior directors and the folks that have the issued phones, but not lower level personnel. So it just depends on the sort of needs. Maybe you have folks that work in the field a lot where that's clearly would be justified. So there's flavors, but it's nice that it exists. The fact that we have tools as options now that we didn't a few years ago is a tremendous benefit. Okay, so that was the last on mobile devices there. Sort of in summation here, whereas we're wrapping up here, I'd like to just sort of talk a little bit about what this is all about, really. So I specifically spoke about email, we talked about social media, and we talked about mobile devices and the technologies involved there. But those won't necessarily, if I was to do this same presentation in 5 years, those may not be what I focus on. I might have something new I'm talking about more. technology continues to evolve, and the way we communicate will do so as well. So a lot of this is creating a framework, a mental framework and a policy framework to adapt to new technologies as they come at us. So we don't get too hung up. The same way you don't want to write a law that references a specific thing or references a specific technology, because that law is then going to be obsolete within a couple years, and you don't want to have to constantly revise it. So we're going to make things format neutral. We're going to make broader rules and just adjust as we go. So communications will continue to evolve. That is a certainty. Whatever we're comfortable with now will continue to shift. Email, people have tried to declare it dead several times over. It is amazingly persistent. But it's being subsidized heavily. It's being more and more supplemented by other more dynamic communication technologies, like those messaging services and things like that. I think you will find it will decrease in importance eventually. It's still going to be around for a while, but we're always looking at new ways. We have no idea what we're going to be using in a decade. We really don't. But we keep looking forward, and we just kind of keep adjusting by these flexible policies. One thing that is consistent is records management does not drive the technology cycle. So we can be sure that records and where they live will always be an afterthought. People are not going to consider that, oh, hey, this thing could be used to store sensitive records. They aren't going to think about that. So it's something we have to all be aware of. Whatever our specific role in an agency is, we need to be educated on top of that so we can ask those questions and say, hey, when somebody says, we're going to start using Slack, I want everybody that's here and anybody you talk to be able to say, wait a sec, so are we going to be pulling information out of that somehow? Are we going to be using it for only a certain type of thing? We need to make sure we define that well before we step into it. So we always want to ask, what about the records? Which is essentially what that webinar I'll be doing on the 10th of October is going to be about. What about the records when we're dealing with other types of technologies? Let's talk about that. Think about the appropriate use. Because just because a technology can do 10 things, it does not mean that in a government context it will be appropriate to use it for all of those 10 things. Private sector and to some extent corporate drives what devices and what technologies can do, because it's cool, we can do all those things. But in a lot of cases, those are not controlled. They're not really thought out with management in mind. So we need to think about what's appropriate. And really, we want to plan for the creation, capture, and retention of records before we're in the thick of it. So it's a lot easier to plan, for example, in your RFP, if you put it out, or when you're looking at, when you're comparison shopping. It's a lot easier if you have a list of things you want to look at beforehand than it is to buy something and a year later realize it only fulfills half of your requirements. And this is what a lot of us have found ourselves with these older systems we may be saddled with, legacy information systems. They were never built with that in mind. We want to avoid continuing that problem. So we can't always fix what's already there, but we can definitely help ourselves by not adding to our own headaches later on. And I know people sometimes, well, I'm going to be retired in 2 years. Well, but have a thought for those of us schmucks that'll be working for the next 50. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. You can put them in the text box or do them through the phone, or you can always email me or call me. So up here, Stephanie Clark is our records unit manager. So if you have questions about stuff that we didn't totally get into here, but if you have questions about records management questions in general, or schedule specific questions, she's the person that's better to talk to, although I can do some of that too. We all share information, so if it goes to the wrong person, it's not a big deal. We just will bounce it to the right one. If you have questions about some of the topics we talked about today, or electronic records management in general, I'm happy to answer your questions. And I need to update this. We've got new email addresses, actually. Got a question. Will there be recording? So we've made a decision not to record these sessions, largely because we feel it can stifle conversation or questions. We will make the slides available. I will send the slides out to everybody that was attending here. And as I promise every time, we are planning on making a stock recorded version of segments of this at some point. It has to do with how much time I have to do it, but we will have stripped audience-less versions of this available at some point, and I'll make sure that's advertised when we do. I started to mention we have new email addresses. These are still valid. They'll still work, but we're now at oregon.gov instead of the state.or.us. So either way, if you email this one, it'll still bounce to us. So thank you, everybody. I'll sit around here in case there's more questions for a little bit. Yeah, I got a question here for anybody left. Do we have a sample mobile device policy considered to be model? Yeah, I can. We actually have the DAS issued a big sample state policy for records management in general, and I'm trying to think if the mobile device part is part of that one or there is another one. The short answer is yes. I can dig one up for you, and I'll make a note of that, and I'll send that out to the group if I can figure out exactly which one I want to use.